The wind had no pity. It came down from the north in November, over the plains of northern Texas, carrying the first bite of a winter that would be hard. This was the year 1887. The wind found nothing to stop it. It flattened the tall blue-stem grass, turning the prairie into a rippling, pale ocean. The sound was a long, dry whisper, like bones rattling. On the edge of this emptiness sat the town of San Madera. San Madera was new. It was a raw collection of pine buildings, a muddy main street, and a deep, churning fear. The town owed its life to the railroad. The fresh steel tracks gleamed beside the town, a silver promise that connected this remote place to the rest of the world. But the railroad was also a scar. It cut across ancient paths, and its iron whistle screamed defiance at the endless sky. The town lived and breathed by the train schedule, by the freight it brought in and the cattle it took out. Far from the steam and smoke, Taka moved with the wind. He was a man of the Numunu, the people. To the whites, they were Commanche. He was hunting horses, the ones that had broken free, the ones with spirits as wild as the land itself. He moved with a quiet discipline, his body lean and hard from a life lived outdoors. His eyes missed nothing: the bend of a grass blade, the distant wheeling of a hawk, the subtle shift in the wind that spoke of weather turning. Taka was respected. He was a warrior, but his strength was in his stillness. He had not always been this way. A year ago, his laughter had been easier. Then came the confrontation with the bounty hunters, men who hunted people for profit, and the loss of the woman he was to marry. Her name was not spoken now, but her absence was a space beside him, a hollow in the air. His grief was a cold stone he carried inside. It had not broken him. It had forged him. He had become more watchful, more deliberate. His duty to his band, the one fire he allowed to burn bright. He thought of them now, his people. They were pressed between the new world of the railroad and the shrinking old world of the open plain. The great herds of bison were gone, replaced by bone pickers and the wire fences of settlers. His people needed to survive. They needed safe passage for their horses, the herds that were their wealth, their spirit, their lifeblood. Miles away, on that same wind, Grace Fallon arrived. She stepped down from the passenger car of the train, her small bag held tight in one hand. She pulled her thin coat close, the wind immediately finding the gaps in the wool. She was the youngest daughter of an Irish family, a family that had come to America seeking everything and had, it seemed, found only hardship. She had been a traveling teacher, moving from one small settlement to another, trying to plant seeds of knowledge in hard soil. Her face was pale with fatigue, but her eyes were a clear, steady blue. They held a strength that was not brittle. It was a flexible, enduring strength. On her left wrist, just below the cuff of her dress, was a small, puckered scar. It was a pale silver mark, a reminder of the night the granary burned, the night her family began to lose its hold. Grace had come to San Madera to escape. She was not running from the law. She was running from a future that had been stolen. Her family farm, the one they had built with their own hands, was gone. It had been taken, legally, by a foreclosure. The man behind the paper, the man who held the debt, was Baron Harlan Pierce. He was a railroad baron, a man who saw land not as a home, but as a number on a ledger. The shipping fees he had charged them were impossible, designed to break them, designed to clear the land for his own expansion. Grace had nothing left but her education and a profound distrust of powerful men. She needed work. She needed to earn her own way, to find a place where she could stand on her own feet, beholden to no one. She walked down the muddy street of San Madera, feeling the eyes of the town on her. This was a place that judged quickly. The social air was thin and sharp. Conflicts over land were common, a low rumble beneath the daily business of the town. She saw men with rifles, not for hunting, but for guarding. They were hard-looking men, their faces weathered. Many were former bison hunters, men left without a trade when their herds were slaughtered. Now, they found work as mercenaries, security for the railroad and the land companies. In the general store, buying a small loaf of bread, Grace heard the talk. The whispers were like the dry grass, rustling with suspicion. Someone had piled stones on the railroad track 2 nights past. A telegraph line had been cut. The immediate blame fell on the Commanche. They were sabotaging the railroad. The men said they were resisting progress. Grace listened. Her skill for negotiation, for understanding the unspoken words, telling her this was not the whole story. It was too simple. Blaming the natives was an easy answer, one that served someone else. The new technology was everywhere, and it was changing the rules. The telegraph office was a small, important building, its wires humming with messages from far away. The repeating rifles the railroad guards carried made a single man a threat to many. The power balance had shifted, tilting away from the horse and the bow, toward steam and the trigger. The law of the town, Grace suspected, was whatever the man with the most money and the most guns said it was. And in San Madera, that man was likely Harlan Pierce, or whoever spoke for him here. While Grace looked for a room, Taka sat in council with the elders of his band. The meeting was held in a sheltered place, away from the worst of the wind. The air smelled of sage and dry wood smoke. The elders were old, their faces maps of seasons and sorrows. They spoke of the railroad, the new fences, the dwindling grass for the horse herds. The council leader, a man named He Reads the Sky, spoke directly to Taka. The railroad baron, Pierce, wanted all the land, even the high grazing pastures. He was pushing the settlers forward, using the railroad as his spear. We must have a path, the elders said. We must have water. Without the high pastures in summer, the herds will weaken. It was a diplomatic mission they needed, not a war they could not win, not against repeating rifles and the endless stream of soldiers the train could bring. They needed an anchor, a connection to the new world that was not made of steel. Your grief has been long. Taka, He Reads the Sky, said, his voice quiet but firm. But the people need you. We need a bridge. We propose a marriage alliance, a bond with the white world, a woman from their side, willing to live with us, to follow our ways, but also to be a voice for us, an arrangement, to secure the grazing paths, a bond of peace. Taka looked at the elder. This was not what he wanted. His heart was a frozen thing, but he was a man of discipline. He understood duty. He saw the cold logic. It was for the horses, for the people. He would be the bridge. He would agree to this union, this contract with an outsider. He would anchor his people to this new, shifting land. Grace found her way to a boarding house run by a woman named Mistress Lavinia Quill. The house was clean, at least if bare. Mistress Quill was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everyone who crossed her threshold. She was a widow, and she had made her own way by providing rooms, meals, and another, more delicate service. She was a matchmaker, a broker of frontier marriages. Grace asked for a room, paying for a week with the few coins she had left. She also asked about work. I am a teacher, she said. Mistress Quill sized her up. The town school is run by the preacher, Reverend Ezekiel Hart. She said, he may not have room, but there is other work, for a woman who is practical. Grace saw a small, printed card on the table near the door. It was an advertisement, discreetly worded. It spoke of ranchers and respected men seeking wives, women of good character to build homes. And it mentioned, in careful script, a need for a graceful bride, a woman of gentle temperament for a special arrangement. Grace felt a cold prickle. She was not here to be sold like livestock. I am here to work, she repeated, to earn a wage. Mistress Quill merely smiled. A small, knowing gesture. We all do what we must to survive. Miss Fallon, she said. "Even the graceful ones." Grace went to her small, cold room. She looked out the window at the raw town. At the endless grass beyond, her past was gone, burned and foreclosed. Her future was a blank, cold page. She was free, but her freedom felt like a cage of its own. She had her dignity, and she would hold on to it. In the Commanche camp, Taka prepared. He would go to San Madera. The arrangement had been made through channels, through intermediaries, men who moved between both worlds. Mistress Quill, the boarding house woman, had been the one to handle the details. She had assured the elders she had found the right woman, a gentle woman, a graceful woman, willing to accept the terms for a peaceful alliance. Two worlds were set on the same board. Taka, driven by the survival of his people and the memory of his loss, moved toward the town. Grace, driven by the need for freedom and the memory of her stolen home, dug in her heels, ready to fight for her next meal. Neither knew the other existed, but the wind was blowing them together, over the same patch of cold, contested earth, a marriage pact for the safety of horses, a free woman needing a place to stand. The game was about to begin. Grace Fallon secured the meeting with Reverend Ezekiel Hart on her second day in San Madera. The church was a simple plank building, smelling of raw pine and the sharp lye soap used on the floors. The wind drummed against the thin walls. Reverend Hart himself was a thin man, his black coat worn at the cuffs and his eyes holding a permanent, worried squint. He listened to her application, his fingers steepled. "You have letters of reference, Miss Fallon." "I do." She passed them over. They were from settlements farther east, praising her diligence and her skill with unruly children. They were, thankfully, dated before her family's troubles. "The work here is challenging," Hart said, avoiding her gaze. He looked at the wall, at a faded print of Jesus walking on water. "We have a small school, a field school, really, a tent, mostly. The children of the town and, well, we try to minister to all." Grace understood the unspoken words. "The native children as well." Hart flinched, as if the topic itself were a spark. "We must bring all souls to the light, Miss Fallon. But the railroad, Mr. Pierce's company, they are the patrons of this town. They value order. They value progress. Any disruption to that, it is frowned upon." He cleared his throat. "The pay is a pittance, barely enough for board. But the work is righteous." Grace felt the familiar, cold knot in her stomach. A pittance. She had heard that word before. It meant she would still be dependent, still one missed meal away from disaster. But it was work. It was teaching. "I accept, Reverend," she said. She left the church and walked back toward the boarding house, the wind pushing against her. The pittance would not be enough. She would need to keep her room at Mistress Quill's, and the cost of that alone would consume the meager salary. She was still trapped. As she entered the boarding house, Mistress Lavinia Quill was waiting for her. The landlady's face, usually a mask of shrewd composure, was pale. She looked agitated, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Miss Fallon, a word." "In the parlor." Grace followed, wary. The parlor was cold, the fire unlit. "Mistress Quill, is something wrong?" "There has been a complication, a change in circumstances." The woman was pacing. "You recall the advertisement, the one for a companion, a graceful bride?" "I recall it. I am not interested, mistress." "Do not be hasty, child." Quill stopped pacing and faced her. "The position, a most respectable one, has been filled, or rather, it was. The young woman I had selected, a Miss Winnie Hale, she has proven unreliable." Quill's voice dripped with contempt. "She took the night train east, with a gambler, a man with patent leather shoes, and, I am sure, not a genuine cent to his name." Quill took a shaky breath. "The arrangement, Miss Fallon was with the Commanche. A peace treaty, you understand, a marriage of alliance, to secure their cooperation with the railroad's expansion. Grace felt a chill. This was not just a marriage, it was politics. "They are due today," Quill whispered, her eyes wide with something like panic. "The delegation, their representative, Taka, a prominent warrior. He is coming to the station to meet his bride, and She swallowed. "I have already accepted their payment, a substantial deposit. I used it to secure my business license for the year, a fee levied by the railroad. You understand." Grace suddenly saw the entire ugly picture. "You have no bride," Grace said flatly. "Winnie Hale is gone." Quill snapped. "But the contract must be honored." "Then you had better find a replacement." Grace turned to leave. "I have," Mistress Quill said. "You, Miss Fallon. Your name, it is Grace. It is a sign. A graceful bride." Grace stared at her, horrified. "That is absurd. I will not be part of your scheme. I have just accepted a post with Reverend Hart." "A post that pays nothing," Quill shot back, her desperation making her cruel. "A post that will see you starve or freeze before Christmas. I am offering you a position of influence, a home, security. This Taka is a man of honor. They say he leads their horse herds. He is respected. They wish to bind their people to the town, to stop the conflicts. By selling a woman, by making an alliance, and it is not forever. That is the beauty of it. It is a trial period. 6 months, through the winter, to see if the alliance holds. If, after 6 months, you wish to leave, you are free to do so. The contract states it explicitly." Grace's mind was racing. 6 months, a contract, a way out of the wind, a way to survive until spring. But to be married, even in name, to a native warrior, she thought of the armed guards, the whispers, the open hatred in the town. "I cannot," she said, but her voice wavered. "Think, child," Quill urged, sensing the weakness. "You stay here. You are a penniless teacher, entirely at the mercy of Reverend Hart, who is himself at the mercy of the railroad. Mr. Pierce holds the lease on the church land. One word from him, and you are both gone. But this, as the wife of Taka, you would have protection. You would be outside Pierce's immediate reach. 6 months, to earn enough to go anywhere you please, to be truly free." The argument was sharp, and it found its mark. Grace thought of her family farm, of Baron Pierce's name on the foreclosure notice, outside his reach. That was a tempting thought. "I would have to meet him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will not agree to anything blind." Mistress Quill's face flooded with relief. Of course, my dear. Just a meeting. He is due at the station in 1 hour." The train station platform was a long, exposed stage. The wind howled across it, carrying the smell of coal smoke and cold iron. Taka stood at the far end, away from the station house. He had come with 2 others, his friend Koa, a man with watchful eyes, and an elder who acted as witness. They had ridden in, their ponies shuffling nervously at the alien sounds of the railroad yard. Taka wore no paint. He was dressed for travel, in smoked buckskins that were practical and clean. His black hair was braided, tied with simple leather strips. He stood with a stillness that was more intimidating than any movement. He was here to fulfill a duty to his people. He was here to accept a white woman, a stranger, to bind his people to this land, to protect their herds from the railroad's hunger. He expected the woman Mistress Quill had described quiet, soft, agreeable. A woman named Winnie. The railroad guards, hired guns in the pay of Harlan Pierce, watched them. There were 3 of them, their coats unbuttoned to show the pistols on their hips. They lounged against the station wall, spitting tobacco juice onto the platform, their eyes full of casual malice. Taka ignored them. He was watching the station door. It opened. Mistress Quill emerged. Her face set in a strained, bright smile, and beside her was a woman Taka had never seen. He did not move, but his senses sharpened. This was not the woman in the description. This one was taller, slender but not frail. Her clothes were worn, a dark wool dress that had seen better days, and a thin coat. Her hair was a simple brown, pulled back tightly, but the wind had loosened strands that whipped across her face. Then she looked at him. Taka felt it like a physical jolt. Her eyes, they were blue, the color of the sky just before the sun breaks, and they were filled with a bright, hot fire. There was fear in them, yes, but it was banked, controlled, mostly. There was defiance. She met his gaze directly. She did not look away. She did not blush or lower her eyes like a docile woman. She looked at him as if he were a problem to be solved, or a storm to be weathered. This was not a gentle bridge. This was a woman of fire. Grace felt his stare. It was not a leering look, like the one she endured from the men in town. It was an assessment, deep, penetrating, and utterly unreadable. He was tall, his face a landscape of hard angles and quiet sorrow. He seemed carved from the wind itself. Beside him, the railroad guards looked soft and loud, their hostility a cheap, brittle thing. This man's silence was heavy. Mistress Quill fluttered forward. "Taka, honored sir, may I present Miss Grace Fallon. There was a change of plan. Miss Hale was called away, but Miss Fallon has graciously agreed to stand in, a woman of great character, a teacher." Taka's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed. He looked from Grace to Mistress Quill, and the landlady visibly shrank. He knew, instantly. He had been deceived. Kawa stepped forward and murmured something in their language. Taka replied, his voice too low for Grace to hear. Then he stepped toward her. One of the railroad guards laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Look at that, boys. Old Quill's found a new teacher for the savages." Grace flinched, but she held her ground. Her chin came up. Taka saw it. He saw her refusal to be cowed. He had been promised a sheep, and he had been given a wolf. A tired, hungry wolf, perhaps, but a wolf nonetheless. He stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she could feel the faint warmth from his body, smell the clean scents of sage and smoke. He held out his hand. In his palm was a simple loop of braided brown leather. It was not a ring. It was a tether, a symbol of a bond. Grace looked at the leather loop. This was the moment, the pittance from the Reverend, or this, the slow starvation of pride, or the leap into the unknown. She thought of Harlan Pierce. She thought of her family's stolen farm. She thought of 6 months. She raised her left hand, the one with the small, silver scar at the wrist. Slowly, deliberately, she put her hand through the loop. His skin was rough and warm as he settled it over her wrist. It was done. From a second-story window in the railroad office, a large man watched the scene through a brass spyglass. Baron Harlan Pierce smiled, a slow, unpleasant expression. Well, Lyle," he said to the thin man beside him. Lyle Crick, his deputy, squinted. "What is it, Mr. Pierce?" "It seems our Commanche friend is trying to secure his land rights. A marriage alliance." Pierce lowered the glass. "He thinks a white wife will give him a claim. He thinks it will stop me." "It's just some washed-up woman," Crick said, scratching his neck. "Any alliance is a threat," Pierce said softly. "Any connection they make to this town, to the law, to the world, is a nuisance. I want all that grazing land. It's perfect for the new spur line, and the water underneath that is the real prize." He turned to Crick. "Have your men keep an eye on them. On both of them. I want to know where she goes. I want to know who she talks to. This peace bride might just be the leverage we need to break them for good." Crick grinned, his teeth stained. Yes, sir, Mr. Pierce. We'll watch her. The moment the brief ceremony was over, Grace turned and walked stiffly back to the boarding house, the leather loop still on her wrist. Taka and his companions had gone, agreeing to return for her in the morning. She found Mistress Quill in the kitchen, pouring herself a large measure of brandy. "You did well, child," the woman said, her good humor restored. Grace pulled the loop from her wrist and slammed it on the table. "Oh, you lied," she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "You used my name. You sold me under false pretenses." "I saved us both," Quill countered, her eyes flashing. "That deposit had paid the railroad levy on this house, a new tax Mr. Pierce decided to invent. If I hadn't paid it, we would both be on the street tonight. I saved you from Reverend Hart's charity, which would have lasted exactly as long as Harlan Pierce allowed it." The name again. Pierce. He was a spider, and his web covered everything. "I will not go," Grace said. "I will find other work." "Where?" Mistress Quill gave a short, harsh laugh. "Do you think Reverend Hart will keep you now? A woman who publicly aligned herself with the Commanche? Even for an hour, do you think anyone in this town will hire you? After you have made an enemy of the railroad, you are blacklisted. Miss Fallon. Whether you go with him or not, you are finished in San Madera. Going with him is the only choice you have left." The trap was shut. Grace saw it, felt its steel teeth. She was ruined, precisely as Quill said. Her choice was to be an outcast in the town or an outcast with the Commanche. She stood silent for a long time, the brandy fumes filling the air. Finally, she picked up the leather loop. It was smooth, worn, and strong. "If I go," she said, her voice low, "it is on my terms." The next morning, she did not wait for Taka to collect her. She packed her small bag and walked out of town. Just as the sun was rising, she walked toward the creek, her shadow long in front of her. Taka saw her coming. He was standing by the horse herd, alone. He had expected Quill to deliver her, like baggage. Instead, she came on her own 2 feet. She walked directly to him, her face pale but resolute in the cold air. "We must have an agreement," she said, her voice clear, not trembling. "We have an agreement." "We have your agreement," she corrected. "Now we will have mine." She pulled a piece of paper from her coat. "I am not the woman you were promised. I am not gentle, and I am not docile. I am here because I have no other choice." "I know," Taka said. His calm was unnerving, but she would not be deterred. "This is a 6-month trial. After that, I am free to go." Taka nodded. "That was the bargain. We will treat one another with respect. I am not your servant. I will not be ordered or struck. I will learn what I must, but I will be treated as an equal. The Numunu do not strike their wives." His voice was flat, but she heard the offense in it. "Respect is earned. You are here. That is a start." She took a deep breath. "For the hardest part. And the nature of this marriage, the intimate part, it will not happen unless I agree. Unless we agree, it is my choice, my right." Taka looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the flicker of fear she was trying so hard to hide. He saw the scar on her wrist. He saw the shadow of the railroad baron, the man who was his enemy. Too, this woman, who had been cheated and cornered, was standing in his camp, dictating terms to him. He found himself, against all expectation, admiring her. She had courage. He gave a single, sharp nod. "We do not take what is not offered. Your body is your own. The decision will be for both." The relief that flooded Grace was so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had, at least, preserved that. Taka turned his gaze to the sky. High above, a single red-tailed hawk circled, its cry a sharp, lonely sound on the wind. He watched it. It was a powerful sign, a warning of trials to come, but also a sign of a clear eye, of a spirit that endured. He looked back at Grace. The winter will be hard. The wind will try to cut us. The storm of men from the town. He nodded toward San Madera. Will try to break us. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something other than duty. She saw a fellow survivor. I will get you through this winter. Taka said, you will get me through the storm of men. It was not a promise of affection. It was a contract for survival. Grace Fallon took a long breath of the cold, clean air. I accept the terms. The announcement was posted outside the town hall, nailed to a board still raw with pine sap. Baron Harlan Pierce was not a man for small gestures. He declared, in bold black type, the expansion of the San Madera spur line. The new route would cut directly across the high grazing pastures, the very land Taka's people needed for their horse herds. As a gesture of goodwill, the notice continued, Pierce's company would offer a community protection contract for a modest fee paid by the town council. His teams of security men, led by Mr. Lyle Crick, would ensure the railroad's construction was not delayed. It was a threat wrapped in the language of civic duty. The railroad was coming, and anyone who stood in its way would be designated an enemy of progress. Grace Fallon read the notice, her stomach tightening. She knew that language. It was the same language used in the letters that had eventually taken her family's farm. It was the polite, legal glove worn over an iron fist. She turned away from the notice, pulling her coat tighter. She still had a bargain to keep, the one she had made with herself. She would teach. She walked to the patch of muddy ground beside Reverend Hart's church, where a large canvas tent billowed in the ceaseless wind. This was the field school. A small group of children were huddled near the tent flap, waiting. 3 were the pale, tow-headed children of a local blacksmith. 2 others were darker, their black hair and broad faces marking them as children of the people, who sometimes came to trade. They all looked cold. Grace smiled, her first genuine smile in days. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "My name is Miss Fallon. Let us go inside and get warm. We will start with letters." As she held the flap open, Reverend Ezekiel Hart appeared from the church. His face was pale, his hands twisting together. "Miss Fallon," he called, his voice strained. She paused, the children stopping behind her. "Reverend, I am just getting started." "A moment, please." He walked over, avoiding the eyes of the native children, who had frozen in place. "Miss Fallon, there has been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding I agreed to the post. The pittance, as you called it, is mine to accept. It is not the money." Hart looked miserable. He glanced toward the railroad office, visible down the street. "It is the company you keep." Grace's blood went cold. "I beg your pardon?" "Your arrangement. With the Commanche, it is known, it is unseemly." "It is a private matter. Reverend, it has nothing to do with my ability to teach arithmetic." "It has everything to do with it." Hart's voice cracked, a whisper of hysteria. "Mr. Pierce's men, Mr. Crick, they informed the council. The town provides this tent. The railroad provides the stove. They will not have their patronage tainted. The townspeople will not send their children to be taught by—" He stopped, unable to finish. "By a woman living with a native," Grace finished for him, her voice sharp and clear. "This is a place of peace. Miss Fallon," Hart pleaded, "we cannot have this conflict. I'm asking you to keep the peace." "By punishing children." Grace looked at the 2 small Commanche children, who were now backing away, their eyes wide with fear. "That is not peace, Reverend. That is cowardice." One of the blacksmith's children, a boy named Samuel, piped up. "Are Maki and Tona leaving?" Before Grace could answer, Lyle Crick himself appeared. He was a thin, wiry man with a stained duster and eyes the color of dirty ice. 2 of his security men were with him. They did not look like guards. They looked like the kind of men who find trouble for a living. You heard the Reverend? Ma'am, Crick said, his voice a lazy drawl. He did not look at Grace, but at the native children. School's not for your kind. Maki, the little girl, grabbed her brother's hand. These children are here to learn, Grace said, stepping between Crick and the children. Crick's eyes finally settled on her. He smiled, a slow, unpleasant unfolding of his thin lips. Are you now the peace bride? Seems you're confused about which side of the line you're on. Miss Fallon, go on, you two, he said to the children. Get back to the creek. The two children turned and ran, their small legs churning through the mud, never looking back. Grace watched them go, her hands clenched into fists, her fingernails biting into her palms. She was shaking with a rage so profound it left her breathless. Samuel, the blacksmith's son, looked at the ground. There, Crick said, satisfied. Peace is kept. You have a good day, Reverend. He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and sauntered away, his men following. Grace turned on Hart. You let this happen. I am one man, he cried, anguish on his face. I am trying to save souls, but they own the ground we stand on. Do not judge me. Miss Fallon, you do not know what it is to build a house for God in a place like this. I know what it is to be a teacher, Grace said, her voice dead. And this is not it. She turned from the tent, from the remaining children, and from the defeated Reverend. Her teaching career in San Madera was over before it had begun. Blinded by anger, she did not return to the camp. She walked through the town, needing to feel the wind, to let the cold air scour the shame from her skin. She found herself outside the telegraph office. She had a few coins. She could send a letter east, to a friend from her teaching days, perhaps ask if there was work, anywhere but here. She entered the small, warm office. The telegraph operator, a young man with a green visor, was hunched over his key, his fingers flying. The air was filled with the sharp, rhythmic clicking. Grace waited, and as she waited, she listened. Her father's general store had housed the first telegraph line in their county. She had learned the code as a girl, finding it a fascinating secret language. She had helped him send and receive orders, messages of birth and death, of crop prices and weather. The rhythm was as familiar to her as her own name. The operator was taking a message, his pencil scratching on a pad. It was coming from the east, from the head office. It was not simple text. It was a cipher, groups of letters, then numbers. But then, a few words came through in plain code, instructions for the operator. Verify Pierce. Eyes only map follows Austin Surveyor. The operator clicked back a question. Repeat reference. The answer came. Subsurface water aquifer priority. Grace felt her breath catch. A map, a secret map, of underground water, the lifeblood of the plains. She looked at the notice she had seen earlier, the one from Pierce. The new spur line cut right across the high pastures, the same pastures the people needed. If Pierce controlled the land and the water beneath it, he would control the entire region. He could dry up every ranch, every farm, and the Commanche herds, all at his whim. He would be a king. The operator finished, tore the sheet from his pad, and looked up at her, his eyes weary. Yes, ma'am. Grace pushed her coins back into her pocket. Nothing, she said, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding. I have changed my mind. She walked back to the small camp Taka had established by the creek. It was a single teepee, a temporary shelter between the town and the larger, hidden camp of his people. He was there, mending a bridle, his hands moving with slow, precise strength. She told him what had happened, the school, the children, Crick, Hart's cowardice. Taka listened, his face unchanging. When she finished, he nodded, as if she had only confirmed what he already knew. The town is his, he said. "The preacher, the law, they are all horses in his herd. They move where he tells them." "They are frightened," Grace said, though it felt like an excuse. "Fear is his weapon," Taka said. "He uses it to clear the path for his iron snake." That night, the attack came. It was not a raid. It was a warning. Grace was sleeping, exhausted from the day, when the sound ripped through the quiet. It was a gunshot, sharp and close. A second shot followed, and she heard a metallic ping as the bullet struck the iron kettle hanging outside the teepee. A third whined through the canvas, high above her head. Stay down." Taka's voice came from the darkness, low and urgent. He was already at the entrance, his rifle in his hands. Grace scrambled from her bedroll, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crouched low, pressing herself against a parfleche box. There were no more shots, only the sound of the wind. And then, farther away, the sound of horses riding hard and fast, back toward the town. After a long silence, Taka moved. He slipped outside. Grace waited, every nerve screaming. He returned after several minutes. In his hand, he held a spent cartridge. "They are gone." "Who?" "Crick's men." He knelt by the low fire, dropping the brass casing into his palm. "I found their tracks." He opened his other hand. In it was a single, beaded moccasin. "And this?" Grace looked at it. "One of your people?" "No," Taka said, his voice hard. "This beadwork is from a northern tribe, one not seen here in many years, and the track it was clumsy, planted, made by a man who does not know how to walk in these." He tossed the moccasin into the fire. It smoked, then curled, the beads melting. "Crick is not just a bully. He is a liar. He will shoot at my camp, and tomorrow he will show this moccasin in town and say we fired first. He is building his excuse for war." He stood up, his decision made. "We are not safe this close to the town. You are not safe. Pack your things." "Where are we going?" "To my people, to the Winu." They rode for an hour, Taka on his horse, Grace on another, her small bag tied behind her. He led her away from the creek, into a series of rolling hills and shallow canyons she had not known existed. The main camp was sheltered in a wide bowl, hidden from the wind and invisible from the plains. It was a small village of hide lodges, horse herds grazing peacefully in the protected valley. Smoke rose from several teepees. As they rode in, people stopped to watch them. Their faces were not hostile, but curious, assessing. This was the woman Taka had taken as a peace bride. This was the white woman. He took her to the largest teepee, one set in a place of honor. He pulled back the flap. "My grandmother," he said. An old woman sat inside, her back straight. She was small, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes as bright and dark as obsidian. She was smoking a small, carved pipe, the smoke fragrant. This was Nahari, the elder. She watched Grace enter and sit. She did not speak, but her gaze was penetrating. She saw the scar on Grace's wrist, the tension in her shoulders, and the fire in her eyes. Finally, Nahari spoke in the Commanche language. Taka translated. She asks why you are here. "Taka brought me. We were shot at by the railroad men." Taka translated. Nahari nodded, as if this were old news. She spoke again, a long, quiet stream of words. "She says the railroad is an iron snake," Taka said, his voice softening as he spoke his grandmother's words. "It is hungry. It follows the path of least resistance. Now, it wants to come through our nest. You cannot break an iron snake. You must make it turn. You must show it that this path is too hard, too dangerous. You must make it afraid of the nest." She looked at Grace. She asks, "What teeth do you have, little white woman?" Grace looked at the old woman, and she understood. This was not a question of pity. It was a question of strength. "The snake is not just iron," Grace said, speaking slowly. Taka translating. It is paper. It is wires. The man, Pierce, he does not have the strength of a warrior. He has the strength of signatures. And a map. She told them what she had heard. The secret map. The underground water. Taka's face was grim. If he controls the water, he controls everything. The herds, the town, the ranches. He will starve us all. We must get that map, Grace said. We must show the town, the government, what he is doing. He is not building a railroad. He is stealing the water. How? Taka asked. His office is guarded. The telegraph is his voice. Here, Grace took the gamble. She laid her one card on the table. The telegraph is a voice I understand. She said. Taka looked at her, confused. I can read the code, Grace said. My father had a machine. I learned as a girl. I heard the message today. If I can get into that office, if I can hear the message when the full map is transmitted, I can copy it. I can make my own map. This is a great risk. This, Grace said, touching the canvas of the teepee. It's a great risk. Living here is a risk. That is the one thing I have learned. There is no safety. There is only a fight or a surrender. I will not surrender. Taka looked at his grandmother. Nahari smiled. A small, deep smile. She spoke one word. Good, Taka translated. She says your teeth are sharp. The strategy was set. It was no longer just about survival. It was about a counteroffensive. They would protect the herds, moving them by night to a more distant pasture. And they would find a way to get Grace to that telegraph. They would collect evidence on Crick. They would expose Pierce. But first, there was one more thing to do. Their alliance, this strange contract, had to be made real in the eyes of the people. It was a bond of honor, and it needed to be witnessed. Taka called the elders, Kawa and Nahari. It was not a wedding. There was no music, no celebration. It was a simple, solemn ceremony as the sun went down. Taka stood before her. He held the same braided leather loop she had kept in her pocket. He took her left hand, the one with the pale silver scar, in front of his family, his friends, and his elders. He slipped the loop over her wrist. Then, he took another thin leather cord and tied it, binding the loop to her wrist with a knot that was both strong and intricate. It was not a shackle. It was a bond. He stepped back. He was not her husband. She was not his wife, not in the way the world understood. But they were bound. They were a partnership, sealed in honor. That night, Grace slept in Nahari's teepee, wrapped in warm buffalo robes. For the first time since she had left her home, she did not feel entirely alone. She was not just a runaway. She was not a victim. She was a partner, a spy. Outside, Taka sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees. He listened to the horses, to the familiar sounds of the winu. The wind rose, carrying the night sounds. From a distant ridge, a coyote called, its voice a long, rising cry that echoed across the plains. It was a lonely sound, but it was not a sound of defeat. It was the sound of the wild, of the night, of the long, hard business of survival. The true conflict had just begun. The iron snake had a voice, and it was a shriek. The steam whistle, designed to clear cattle from the tracks, echoed for miles, setting the horse herds on edge. A spooked horse was a lost horse, and Taka's wealth, his people's survival, was measured in hooves. He spent his days acclimating the animals, moving the herds closer to the tracks, then farther away, teaching them that the sound was just empty noise, a white man's boast. He had a horse for Grace, a mare, a deep blue roan with black-tipped ears and a spray of white spots across her flanks, as if she had been dusted with frost. Her name was Blue Smoke. She was fast, intelligent, and had a stubborn streak that Taka recognized. She is not for a beginner, he said, holding the simple rope bridle. I am not a beginner, Grace replied, pulling her worn coat tight. I grew up on a farm. We had plow horses, not creatures like this, but I can ride. He watched her approach the mare. She did not reach for the bridle, but held her hand out, palm down, letting the horse smell her. She spoke, her voice low and calm, the same voice she had used on the frightened children by the church tent. Blue smoke lipped at her sleeve, then tossed her head, but did not move away. "She sees you," Taka said, surprised. "She will carry you." He taught her the way his people rode, not with the heavy, structured saddle of the whites, but with a light pad and a balance that came from the legs, from becoming part of the horse. Grace was a quick study. She was sore. She was tired, but she did not complain. Every day, she rode out with him, her body learning a new language of movement, her eyes scanning the brown, wind-swept plains. She had not, however, given up on teaching. If the town would not have her, she would make a school of her own. Nahari gave her use of a large, older tipi that was used for storage. Grace cleaned it, and with the help of Kawa's wife, she set up a small, warm space. She started with the Commanche children. They were shy at first, their language a barrier, but Grace used pictures, drawing letters in the dirt floor, pointing to the sky, to a horse, to the fire. Taka watched from the entrance one afternoon. He saw her teaching them the English word horse, and then pointing to Taka, and then pointing to the child, and back to the horse, making them understand the word was a bridge, a thing they could all share. Then, one morning, a small figure appeared on the ridge. It was Samuel, the blacksmith's son, the boy who had watched her defend the native children. He had walked the 2 miles from town, alone. "My PA says," the boy said, twisting his cap, "if you're teaching, I ought to be learning." Grace felt a bloom of warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Then come in, Samuel. We are just learning the word friend." Soon, 2 other children from the town, whose families lived on the outskirts and felt little loyalty to the railroad, began to come. Her school was a quiet, radical act. A single tent where the 2 worlds were not at war, but were simply learning their letters together, their voices mingling. While Grace built her bridges of chalk and slate, Taka and Kawa spent their nights watching the railroad. They moved like shadows, their ponies shod in buffalo hide to muffle their steps. They were watching Lyle Creek. On a moonless night, they found what they were looking for, far from the lights of town, along the proposed route of the new spur line. They saw a lantern. They crept closer, their bellies to the cold ground. It was Crick, with 2 of his men. They were not guarding anything. They were pounding wooden survey stakes into the ground. "The surveyors from the railroad company were here last week," Kawa whispered, his breath clouding. "They set the line." "This is not that line," Taka whispered back. He watched Crick consult a map, then move 50 yards north into the grazing land and pound another stake. "He is moving the line. He is stealing the land, stake by stake. He will claim this was the official survey, and the railroad will fence it." It was a slow, arrogant theft, done under the cover of darkness. They had their proof of Crick's methods. Now they needed to disarm his master. Then the weather turned. The wind, which had been a constant, cold pressure, died. The air grew still, and the sky turned a flat, bruised gray. Nahari sniffed the air, her face grim. "The white buffalo comes," she said. The first flakes were small, almost an afterthought. Within an hour, it was a blinding, swirling wall of white. The temperature plummeted. The first blizzard of the season had arrived. And it was a monster. There was no thought of maps, or railroads, or schools. There was only survival. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to tear the teepees from the ground. The cold was a living thing, a predator seeking entry. The greatest danger was to the horses. They would drift with the wind, get lost in the whiteout, and freeze. Taka, Koa, and the other men rode out into the heart of it, their faces wrapped in cloth, to push the herds into the most sheltered canyons. Grace stayed with Nahari, helping the women secure the lodges, bringing the weakest of the foals inside, next to the fire. The teepee was a fragile cone of warmth in a universe of ice. They melted snow for water and shared dried meat, listening to the storm scream outside. Taka returned after hours, his body rigid with cold, ice clinging to his braids. Grace met him at the entrance, pushing a steaming cup of willow bark tea into his hands. His fingers were too numb to hold it, so she held it to his lips. He drank, the hot, bitter liquid restoring some life. He looked at her, his eyes raw from the wind. He saw no fear in her. He saw exhaustion, and he saw resolve. She was not a guest. She was not a burden. She was working, pulling her weight, her hands chapped and raw from wringing out wet hides. "The herds," she asked. "They are in the deep canyon. They will hold," he said. His voice was hoarse. "We did not lose any." They sat by the small fire, the blizzard a roaring giant just outside the hide walls. They were pressed close together, sharing the small circle of life. He found himself telling her about other storms, about the winter he had spent alone as a boy, his vision quest. He spoke of the woman he had lost, not her name, but the emptiness of that loss, like a teepee with no fire. Grace listened, and she spoke, too. She told him about her father, about the smell of ink and paper in his store, about the pride he had in the telegraph. And she told him about the fire, the one that had left the scar on her wrist, how she had run in to save the account books, the only record of their lives, and a burning beam had fallen. She had saved the books, but it had not mattered. Pierce's lawyers had taken the farm anyway. "He does not just take the land," Taka said, looking at the pale scar in the firelight. "He burns the people, too." In that moment, he did not see the peace bride he had been forced to accept. He saw a woman who, like him, had been scarred by the world and had refused to break. She was, he realized, a warrior in her own way. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the world was a silent, dazzling, frozen white. The railroad was shut down. The telegraph lines were down. San Madera was cut off. But Baron Pierce had already laid his groundwork. As soon as the lines were cleared and the train could move, he called a meeting of the town council. Reverend Hart was there, as were the blacksmith, the saloon owner, and the general store proprietor. Pierce was magnanimous. He spoke of the hardship the storm had caused. He spoke of the future, of the prosperity the railroad would bring. "But we must have security," he said, his voice reasonable. "The Commanche, in their current location, are a threat. They sit on the water we need to expand. They frighten away investment." He slid a paper across the table. "I am prepared to offer the town a generous compensation, a fund for a new schoolhouse, a new church, managed by the railroad. Of course, in exchange, the council simply needs to officially designate the high pastures as railroad land, for the good of the community. Evict the native inhabitants, forcibly, if necessary." Reverend Hart looked at the paper. A new church, a proper school, made of wood, not canvas. He thought of Grace, of her defiant school, mixing children he was supposed to be saving. He thought of the cold and the endless struggle. Pierce was offering an easy answer. "It is their ancestral land," Hart murmured, though his hand twitched toward the paper. "It is Texas land, Reverend," Pierce said, his voice hardening. "And it is needed for progress. Are you on the side of progress, or are you on the side of the past?" Hart looked at the other council members. He saw the same hunger in their eyes. For money, for security, for an end to the conflict. He saw them nod, one by one. His own conscience was a small, cold voice, easily drowned out. He did not object. Grace needed to know the timeline. The storm had delayed everything. She rode Blue Smoke into town on the pretext of buying supplies, Samuel's father having given her a list. The town was cold to her in a new way. Women who had nodded to her before now crossed the street to avoid her. In the general store, the proprietor served her, but his words were clipped, his eyes hostile. Lyle Crick's men were everywhere, lounging on the boardwalks, their rifles prominent. The rumor had taken root. She was the Commanche spy. She ignored them and walked to the telegraph office. The young operator, whose name was Ben, looked exhausted. The storm had snapped the line in 2 places, and he was struggling with a backlog of messages. His hand was cramping. "You look tired, Ben," Grace said, leaning on the counter. "It's this key, ma'am," he complained. "It's sticking. The spring's gone soft from the cold. Every message is a fight." Grace smiled. "My father had one like that. Sometimes, a small piece of folded leather, just under the tension screw, can help." She slid a small, thin strip of deer hide from her pocket. "Like this." He looked at her, then at the key. He was desperate. "Well, I suppose it cannot hurt." He fumbled with the screw. "Here," Grace said, her voice casual. "Let me—" She reached over, her fingers nimble. She adjusted the screw, slid the leather shim into place, and tapped the key. The click was sharp, clean, and fast. Ben's eyes went wide. "Well, that's perfect." He tapped it himself, grinning. "You're a wonder, Miss Fallon. I don't care what they say about you." "People talk," Grace said, shrugging. "I'm just glad I could help." She leaned on the counter, as if to chat. "Seems you have a lot of traffic from the head office." "Never stops," he grumbled, starting to sort his message slips. "All this railroad business, Mr. Pierce is waiting on a big dispatch, a final survey map. He's been pacing a trench in the snow about it. Supposed to be here 3 days ago." "A map?" Grace asked, her voice light. "Yep, some special new one. It's in a priority cipher, coming from the main office in Austin. They're sending it again. Now that the line is clear, I'm to expect it by let's see." He checked his log. "By the full moon, day after tomorrow. Mr. Crick himself is coming to collect the decode. Top priority." "Well," Grace said, pushing away from the counter, "I wish you luck with it." She paid for her small supplies at the general store and left town, the stares of Crick's men following her like bullets. She rode fast, her mind electric, day after tomorrow. The full moon. When she returned to the camp, Nahari was waiting for her. The old woman had been watching her. She had seen the way Grace rode, the way she taught the children, the way she had held the cup for Taka. Nahari motioned her into the teepee. She held something in her hand. It was a bracelet, braided not from leather, but from the dark, coarse hair of a wolf's mane. It was old, worn smooth with time. She took Grace's left hand, the one with the railroad tie bond, and gently tied the wolf hair bracelet above it. She spoke, her voice a soft rasp. Taka, who had entered behind Grace, translated. "She says this is a charm for courage, from the wolf, who knows how to be alone, and also how to be part of the pack. She says we did not choose you because you were a graceful bride. We chose you because your heart was strong enough for this fight. Your name was not the sign. Your scar was." Grace looked at the dark braid against her skin, next to the leather loop. She was no longer just Grace Fallon, the dispossessed teacher. She was a woman bound to a new people, by a new purpose. The full moon was 2 days away. The full moon was a cold, silver coin in the black sky. It lit the snow-covered plains, making the world a stark landscape of white and shadow. Inside Nahari's tipi, the air was warm, thick with the smell of sage and smoked hide. They planned in low voices, their words a quiet conspiracy against the night. "The shift changes at 6, Grace explained, drawing a crude map of the station in the tipi's dirt floor. "Ben, the operator I helped, Goes home. The night operator, a man loyal to the railroad, takes over. Ben told me Crick is coming for the decoded map himself. He will not pick it up from the main telegraph office. It is too sensitive. It will be in a locked dispatch box, delivered to the freight house across the tracks, waiting for him. A 5-minute window, Taka said. He had been listening, his eyes fixed on her drawing. Between the message arriving and Crick arriving. Crick is arrogant. Grace said, he expects the world to wait for him. I think we have more than 5 minutes. But the freight house will be guarded. Then the guards must be occupied, Kawa said. He was sitting cross-legged, checking the stitching on his moccasins. He was Taka's closest friend, and his eyes held a quick, restless intelligence. A fire, north, by the railroad's wood pile. It will draw them away from the station. They are jumpy. They will think it is a raid. Taka nodded. It is a good diversion, but the freight yard itself... Grace looked at him. Crick's men are watching the front, but the back, near the creek, is not fenced. They use it for cattle loading. It is open to the plains. A slow understanding passed between them. The horses, Taka said. A second diversion, not a fire, but sound, confusion. Grace thought of the mare he had given her. Blue smoke, she said. Taka looked at her, a brief flicker of surprise in his eyes. Yes, blue smoke. She is fast, and she is smart. She can lead a few ponies, create a stampede. It will make them think we are stealing horses. It will pull the last guards from the freight house. It is too much. Kawa argued. Fire, horses, and you, sister. He nodded to Grace. Going inside. One thing goes wrong, and we are all caught. One thing goes wrong. We lose the water, we lose everything, we do it all. Dusk, the following evening. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. A pale line of orange was the only thing left of the day. Kawa slipped away on foot, a shadow moving toward the town's northern edge. Taka and Grace waited, hidden in a shallow depression a quarter-mile from the freight yard. He had blue smoke and 4 other ponies, their hooves muffled. Grace's heart was a hammer against her ribs. She was not a teacher. She was not a peace bride. She was a thief, about to risk her life on the word of a tired telegraph operator. A faint shout carried on the wind. Then a glow, a flicker of orange against the dark sky. Kawa's fire. Now, Taka said. They heard the alarm bell from the town, a frantic clanging sound. Men were shouting, running toward the woodpile. Taka vaulted onto his own horse. He gave a sharp slap to the rumps of the ponies. Go! He yelled, his voice a sharp command. He rode with them, pushing them toward the open side of the freight yard. Blue smoke, as if she understood, took the lead, her head high. The small herd hit the yard at a full gallop. They thundered between stacks of barrels and piles of railroad ties. A sudden explosion of noise and dust. A lone guard, left behind by the fire, fired his rifle into the air. They're in the yard. They're after the horses. Taka peeled away, vanishing back into the darkness as the ponies scattered. Their purpose served. Go, Grace, go! His voice came from the shadows. Grace ran. Her legs felt heavy, her boots sinking into the muddy snow. She kept to the shadows of the buildings, crossed the open patch of ground, and slipped through the unlocked side door of the freight house. The inside was vast and cold, a cavern smelling of machine oil, raw lumber, and grain. A single lantern burned in a small office built into the corner. She moved toward it, her heart in her throat. She reached the office door and froze. There was someone inside, a woman. The woman was putting on her hat, getting ready to leave. She was young, with blonde hair and a fashionable, if worn, dress. Grace had seen her once, a fleeting glimpse in the window of Mistress Quill's parlor. You, the woman said, her voice a startled gasp. She recognized Grace. Everyone in town knew the face of the Commanche bride. "You cannot be in here. I'll scream." "Please do not," Grace said, her voice shaking but firm. "You are Winnie Hale." The woman's face paled. She was the one who was supposed to be here. She was the original bride, the one who had run off with a gambler. "I am not here for him," Grace said quickly, seeing the fear in Winnie's eyes. "I am not here for Taka. I am here for this." She pointed to the heavy metal dispatch box on the desk. It was stenciled with the railroad's logo, and a tag marked it for Lyle Crick. "That is company property," Winnie said, her hand going to the door. "It is a map," Grace said, taking a step closer. "A map of the underground water. Pierce is going to use it to take everything. Your family's land, too, if they have any. He is lying to the town. He is lying to everyone." Winnie hesitated, her hand frozen. "Mr. Crick, he gave me this job. He is my employer." "Is that all he is?" Grace asked, her voice low. She saw the faint bruise on the woman's neck, half hidden by her collar. "I know men like him. I know what they promise, and I know how they lie." Winnie Hale looked at the dispatch box, and her posture, which had been frightened, turned hard. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a cold, quiet rage. "He lied," she whispered. The words were venom. "He told me I was smart. He said he saw my potential, that I was more than just some mail-order bride." She looked at Grace, a bitter kinship passing between them. "That gambler, the one I ran off with, he was on Crick's payroll. Crick paid him to take me away, to get me out of the way so he could control me. He told me the story himself. He laughed about it." Winnie's choice was made. The sisterhood of the deceived was a powerful bond. "I cannot open the box," Winnie said, her voice quick and low. "The key is in the safe." "But—" She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, brass key. "This opens the safe. He trusts me to lock up his whiskey." "The fool!" She pushed the key into Grace's hand. "He will not be here for 10 minutes. He is watching the fire, enjoying the show. Take it and ruin him." Winnie did not wait for a reply. She grabbed her bag and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. Grace's hands were trembling. She ran to the small wall safe, hidden behind a calendar. The key turned. Inside was a bottle, some papers, and a larger, heavier key. She grabbed it, ran to the dispatch box, and unlocked it. It opened with a click. Inside was a single, folded document, an official survey map, covered in lines and notations, the ink still fresh. She did not stop to read it. She shoved it deep into the bodice of her dress, beneath her coat. She ran from the office, out the same side door she had entered. The yard was quieter. The diversion was over. Taka was there, on the edge of the shadows, holding the reins of blue smoke. "You have it." "I have it." A shot exploded through the night. There, by the platform, it was Lyle Crick's voice. He had not been at the fire. He had been waiting. Grace ran, scrambling toward Taka. Crick fired again. The bullet kicked up snow at her feet. Another shadow moved. Kawa. He had circled back, providing cover. He rose from behind a water barrel and fired his own rifle toward Crick, forcing the man to duck. "Go run, I am behind you." Taka grabbed Grace's arm. Throwing her onto Blue Smoke's back, he leapt up behind her. "Kawa now." Kawa turned to run. Crick, enraged, stepped out and fired wildly. Kawa cried out, a sharp, choked sound. He stumbled, clutching his shoulder, and fell to one knee. Taka saw it. He was on the horse with Grace, ready to ride. Crick was reloading, his men running up. Kawa was on the ground, wounded. It was a choice that took half a second. Freedom or his friend. "Hold fast," he snarled at Grace. He spurred his horse, not away from the fight, but toward it. He swept past Kawa, leaning down. grabbing his friend's shirt. With a powerful wrench, he hauled Kawa up, draping him over the front of the horse, a dead weight. "Taka!" Grace cried, clinging to his back. The horse screamed, carrying 3 people. "Go grace the bridge!" Taka yelled. He slid off the horse, hitting the ground running. He slapped Blue Smoke's flank. "Ride, ride, do not stop." Blue Smoke, spooked and loyal, bolted. Grace grabbed the mane, her heart seizing. She looked back. Taka was on foot, dragging Kawa into the deep shadows, away from the railroad, toward the camp. Crick and his men were caught between, firing at the fleeing horse, firing at the shadows. Grace was alone, on a runaway horse, with the map. She rode for the wooden trestle bridge that crossed the half-frozen creek. It was her only path back. She heard the men behind her, now on their own horses, closing the distance. She reached the bridge. Blue Smoke's hooves hammered on the wooden planks. The sound was a desperate drumbeat. A bullet whined past her ear. She was a perfect target, silhouetted against the snow. She was not going to make it. She pulled back on the reins, a sudden, brutal stop that almost threw her. Blue Smoke reared, confused. Grace did not hesitate. She slid from the horse's back, slapped its rump one last time to send it running, and scrambled to the railing of the bridge. Crick and his men were thundering toward her. She looked down. It was a 20-foot drop to the gully. In the moonlight, she could see the dark ribbon of water, choked with ice. She took a breath, clutched the front of her coat, and jumped. The impact was a brutal, airless slam. She hit the shallow water, her legs buckling. The cold was a physical blow, a stunning, absolute shock that stole her breath. She went under, swallowing icy water, and came up sputtering. She heard the horses stop on the bridge directly above her. "Where is she? Did you see her?" "Fell. I think she jumped." A harsh laugh. It was Crick. "She's in the creek. Stupid. She'll freeze to death in 10 minutes. Or she broke her neck. Either way, the problem is solved." He spat. "Forget her. The map is gone. But Taka and the other one, they're wounded. They went east. Find them." The horses thundered off, their sound fading. Grace was alone. She was alive. She forced herself to move, her limbs already numb, her teeth chattering so violently she thought her jaw would break. She pulled herself from the water, her clothes instantly stiffening with ice. The dispatch box was still there, a hard lump against her skin. She stumbled, fell, and crawled her way back to the camp. It took an age. She was moving on pure animal instinct. She pushed through the flap of Nahari's teepee. The scene inside was from a nightmare. Kawa was lying on a pallet, his wife sobbing as she pressed hides against a dark, spreading stain on his shoulder. Taka was there, his face a mask of gray stone. He looked up and saw her. He saw her, covered in ice and mud, shaking uncontrollably, but alive. The discipline that had held him all his life broke. For 1 second, Taka, the warrior, the hunter, was gone. He trembled, a deep, uncontrolled shudder that ran through his entire body. It was not cold. It was the raw, paralyzing fear of a loss he had not realized he could not bear. He lunged forward, grabbing her arms, his fingers digging in. "You are alive." It was not a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "Yes," Grace chattered, her voice barely a sound. "The map." She fumbled inside her frozen coat, her fingers useless. He helped her, his hands rough, pulling the sodden paper from her dress. He opened it. The ink, cheap and thin, had run. The water had turned it into a meaningless blue-black blur. The lines of the survey, the notations, the numbers of the aquifer, all of it was gone. A meaningless, soaked piece of paper. All of it, for nothing. "No," Grace whispered, staring at the ruin. She was shaking, but not just from cold. "No, I can..." She looked at Taka, her eyes burning in her white face. I can draw it. Ben was sending it. I read the code. Before I saw the paper, the numbers, the lines, I read it as it came. She collapsed, the cold finally claiming her. Nahari was there instantly. She and Kawa's wife were stripping the frozen clothes from Grace, wrapping her in the thickest, warmest buffalo robes. Taka stood, useless, clutching the ruined map. Nahari took Grace's blue, numb hands in her own small, wrinkled ones. She put them to her mouth and breathed on them, her own warm, living breath a prayer against the ice. She rubbed them, her touch surprisingly strong, forcing the blood to move, forcing the life to stay. The next day, the town was buzzing. Lyle Crick had spread the word the Commanche bride was a thief and a spy. She had attacked the freight office, stolen railroad property, and was responsible for a guard being injured. Reverend Hart, his face a mask of pious sorrow, heard the news. His small rebellion of conscience was over. He was a man of peace, and this was violence. He was a man of order, and this was chaos. He walked to the church and nailed a new notice to the door. It officially expelled Grace Fallon from her teaching duties and forbade her, as a known criminal and agent of discord, from setting foot on church property. His war with his conscience was over, and his conscience had lost. In the camp, the cost of their victory was high. The horses were scattered, tired. The food was lower than ever, and Kawa was burning with fever. The bullet was still in him. Nahari hung rattles and charms at the tipi entrance. She lit a bundle of sage, letting the sacred smoke wash over the wounded man. It was a piaputu, a purification, a plea to cleanse the poison of the white man's bullet. Taka stood outside the tipi, listening to his friend's pained breathing. He looked at the vast, uncaring winter sky. Grace was inside, weak but alive, wrapped in furs, already scratching lines onto a piece of scraped hide with a piece of charcoal. He had followed the path of strategy. It had led to this, his friend dying, his people in more danger than before. He closed his eyes. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for a new path. Ancestors, he thought, his heart a cold, heavy stone. I am lost. The way of the warrior has failed. Keep the path, the one where the heart leads. Show me the way. The wind blew cold, offering no answer. The winter was not yet half done, and they were already exhausted. Kawa's breathing was a shallow, bubbling rasp. The fever was in him, a fire that burned hotter than the small, smokeless fire Nahari tended. Lyle Crick's men were sweeping the plains, emboldened by their belief that Taka and Kawa were both wounded and running. The camp in the hidden bowl was no longer safe. It was the first place they would look. Taka knew they had to move. To stay was to be trapped. He cannot ride. Kawa's wife, a woman named Meadowlark, said, her voice raw with fear. She wiped her husband's forehead with a damp cloth. He will not ride, Taka said. He was already constructing a travois, lashing 2 long teepee poles together with wet rawhide, creating a bed that could be dragged behind a horse. We will move him. We must all move. The horses, too. Grace watched, her body a single, deep ache. The jump into the icy creek had stolen her strength. A persistent chill had settled into her bones, one that no fire seemed to touch. She was wrapped in 2 thick buffalo robes, but she was still shivering. I can ride, she said, forcing her voice to be steady. She held up the piece of scraped hide, the one she had barely started. I have the map. Here. She tapped her temple. It will not be lost. We must go. Taka looked at her, his gaze lingering on the unnatural pallor of her skin. He looked at his dying friend. He looked at his grandmother, Nahari, who was packing herbs into a small pouch, her movements economical and grim. He had led them here, and he would lead them out. They left under a low, heavy sky. The air was unnaturally still, the color of a fresh bruise. Taka put Grace on blue smoke, He tied the travois, carrying Kawa to his own steady pony. Nahari and Meadowlark rode alongside, a small, desperate party. They slipped out of the canyon and headed for the broken lands to the west, a place of steep gullies and rock, where trackers would have a harder time. They traveled for 2 hours. Then the weather that had been threatening all day finally broke. It was not snow. It was a sharp, stinging sleet and ice rain that came down in horizontal sheets, driven by a new, brutal wind. The world dissolved into a gray, clicking misery. The ice pellets stung their faces, coated their clothes, and turned the ground into a treacherous sheet. Kawa began to groan, a low, terrible sound that was barely audible over the wind. Grace's shivering became uncontrollable. The dampness in her lungs, left over from the creek, felt as if it were freezing solid. She clung to Blue Smoke's mane, her vision blurring. The world was a white, stinging void. Taka saw her swaying in the saddle. She was a breath away from collapsing. Kawa would not last another hour in this. He was trapped between 2 lives, the one he was bound to by duty, and the one he was bound to by he did not have a name for it. He changed direction, turning the group sharply north into a narrow cut in the rock. "There is a place," he yelled over the storm. "A shelter, not far." He knew this place. It was called White Bone Canyon. It was a deep, natural rock shelter, an overhang where an ancient river had once carved the stone. It was a place his people sometimes avoided, said to be full of echoes, but it was safe, and it was dry. They stumbled into the shelter, the wind howling past the entrance, leaving them in a sudden, shocking quiet. It was a cave, deep and high. Taka slid from his horse and was at Grace's side before she could fall. He lifted her down. Her body was rigid, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them click. She was burning with fever. He half-carried her to the driest part of the cave, laying her on a pile of furs. He turned to his friend. He and Meadowlark moved Kawa, travois and all, near the back wall. Nahari was already there, pulling out her pouches. "A fire," Taka said, his voice a command. He found a stash of dry wood left by a previous hunting party. High on a ledge, in moments, he had a small, bright fire going, its light pushing back the immense, icy dark. Grace was shaking, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She was lost in the fever. The warrior in Taka, the man of discipline, vanished. He was just a man, terrified of the cold. He knelt beside her, pulling the robes tighter. It was not enough. He worked with a fierce, quiet intensity. He unlaced her frozen boots and pulled them off, his hands rough but sure. He chafed her icy feet, trying to force life back into them. "Nahari," he said, his voice low. The old woman came, looked at Grace, and then at Kawa. She gave Taka a small skin of bitter herbs. "For the fever," she said. "The rest is for the air and the fire." Taka mixed the herbs with hot water from his own pouch, forcing the bitter liquid past Grace's lips. Then he stood. "Watch her." He picked up his rifle and a length of rope. He walked to the mouth of the cave and, without a word, stepped back out into the ice storm. He was gone for less than an hour, an eternity in the howling dark. When he returned, he was a figure of ice, but in his hand, he carried a freshly killed rabbit. He skinned it with swift, practiced motions. He spitted some of it over the fire and boiled the rest into a thin, hot broth. Kawa was tended by his wife. Nahari was chanting, her voice a low hum against the storm. Taka's world shrank to the small, shivering woman by the fire. He lifted her, propping her against his chest. "Grace," he said, his voice close to her ear. "You must drink." She whimpered, turning her head away. He was relentless. He held her jaw gently, firmly, and spooned the hot broth into her mouth. It was a tenderness few had ever seen in him. It was the care of a man who was not giving orders, but was pleading with life itself. He fed her the broth, bit by bit, until her shivering began to ease. The chattering of her teeth subsided into a long, exhausted sigh. The storm raged. The ice clicked and hissed against the stone outside. In the small bubble of firelight, Kawa slept, his breathing still ragged but, for now, stable. Nahari dozed, her head on her chest. Grace's eyes opened. The fever had not broken, but it had receded. She was warm. She was dry. She was looking at Taka, who sat watching her. His shoulders slumped with a fatigue he would never have admitted. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a rasp. "I came back," he said. "The woman you lost," Grace murmured, her thoughts disconnected by the fever. "You must have loved her very much." Taka's face tightened. He had not spoken of her, not in a year. "I did," he said. The words were stones. "You are a good man," Grace whispered. "You are kind. Under all the—" She waved a weak hand. "The warrior." He looked at her, at the scar on her wrist, at the weariness that clung to her. "You are not a good captive, Grace Fallon. You are not docile. You are not the graceful bride I was promised." "I know," she said, her eyes holding his. "I am sorry." "I am not," he said. The admission surprised him. "You are fierce. You are a fighter. You jumped into the ice." A long silence settled between them, filled only by the wind and the crackle of the fire. He sat beside her, on the edge of her furs, his hand, rough and warm, found hers. She did not pull away. Her fingers, thin and cold, curled around his. It was a simple touch that felt more binding than any contract. "Taka," she said, her voice small. "A question." He leaned toward her. It was not a sudden movement. It was a slow, inevitable tilt, like a tree leaning toward the only light. He was close enough to feel the warmth of her breath, to see the fever bright in her eyes. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a kiss of profound, shared loneliness. It tasted of wood smoke and bitter herbs, of ice and desperation. It was a promise, a long, deep kiss that said, "I see you. I am here. We are alive." He felt something in his chest, the cold stone of his grief, shift. It did not disappear, but it made room. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were closed. The fierce woman who had come, the one he had not asked for, had done the one thing he thought impossible. She had awakened the part of him that had died, the part that wanted to feel, to live, not just to endure. He did not have words for it. He was a man of the plains, of horses and wind. His language was action. Grace, weak but clear. Read the truth in his silence. This was not the contract. This was not duty. This was a choice, made in the safest place they had, a pocket of warmth in the middle of a killing storm. He lay down beside her on the furs, pulling the heaviest robe over them both, his body a solid line of warmth against her. He held her, listening to the ice melt and drip from the stone roof, a sound like a clock ticking in a quiet room. They were not a warrior and a captive. They were just a man and a woman, holding back the dark. When Grace woke, the storm was over. The morning light was a pale, cold blue, reflected off a world that was now encased in glittering ice. She was clear-headed. The fever was gone, leaving only a deep, bone-weary weakness. She was still in Taka's arms. He was awake, and had been for some time, just watching her. The night, the kiss, the shared warmth, was not a fever dream. It was a solid, quiet truth between them. She sat up, her body aching, but her mind sharp. "The map," she said, her voice stronger. She found her charcoal stick and the piece of scraped hide. Taka watched, saying nothing. As she closed her eyes, her fingers tapped against her knee, finding the rhythm. Click, 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 click. She began to draw. She did not hesitate. The memory, seared into her mind by the cold and the fear, was perfect. She drew the lines of the railroad. She drew the creek, and then she drew the hidden lines, the ones that marked the survey of the aquifer, the secret path of the underground water. She added the numbers, the depths, the flow rates. It was all there. She had stolen Pierce's prize, not with her hands, but with her mind. When she was finished, she handed the hide to Taka. He looked at it, his eyes tracing the lines. This was their weapon. This was the tooth that Nahari had spoken of. He stood, went to his own pack, and took something from it. It was a small, tightly braided cord, made of dark leather and black horsehair, polished smooth with age. It was more intricate than the simple loop he had given her at the station. He came back to her. He took her left hand, gently. He tied the cord just above the wolf hair braid and the simple leather loop. 3 bonds, each one different. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice low. "It was her mother's. It is our family. It means you are of the herd." He touched the cord. "But it is not a rope. It means you are free to run. You are one of the people, and you are yourself." She looked at the braid on her wrist, and then at him. She realized, no longer Grace Fallon of nowhere. She had a place. The sound of a horse, slipping on the ice outside, broke the quiet. A scout, one of the men Taka had sent to watch the town, slid his horse to a stop. He was breathless, his face grim. "Taka, the news is bad," he said, not dismounting. "Crick, he did not wait. He rode to the county seat while the storm was high. He told the judge the new Munu had burned the freight yard. He got an emergency order. He has the county seal." Taka's face went hard. "The seal?" "He is at the railroad office now, stamping papers. He is making the theft legal. He is filing the new survey lines, claiming our grazing land for the railroad today." Grace stood up, pulling the robe around her. She stood next to Taka. The small, peaceful world of the cave was gone. "He has a paper stamp," she said, her voice clear and cold. Taka looked from the scout to Grace, and then down at the map she had just drawn. "He has a lie," he said. "We have the truth. The truth is useless if it stays in this canyon." Grace said, "He is using the telegraph. He is telling the world his lie. We must tell our truth." Taka looked at her, and a new, hard resolve settled on his face. The grief was still there, but the indecision was gone. He knew the path. "We cannot fight his seal with guns," Taka said, "but you can fight his wires." "The telegraph station," Grace said. It was not a question. "Before the sun rises tomorrow." Taka said, "We will send this." He held up the hide map. "We will send the truth to the capital, to the Austin newspaper. We will tell a bigger story than his." The storm in his heart had finally stilled. He had a partner. He had a purpose. The storm for the world, the real one, was just about to begin. The hour before dawn was a cup of black, frozen ink. There was no moon, only a hard glitter of stars in a sky that promised no warmth. San Madera was a collection of sharp, dark rectangles, its breathing shallow, its sleep uneasy. This was the time. Taka's small force moved not as one, but as 3 fingers of a hand, closing on the town. Kawa was with him. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest in a sling Nahari had fashioned, his face pale and tight with pain. But his eyes were alive with a cold fire. The bullet had passed through the muscle, missing the bone. He was weak, but his hatred for Crick was a stronger fuel than blood. They moved on foot, 2 shadows detaching from the greater dark, their target the patrol routes between the main street and the railroad yard. The second finger was Nahari. She was not a warrior, but she was a general. She led 2 young men, and they had the herd, nearly 40 horses, moving them in a slow, silent arc toward the west end of the tracks. The opposite end from where Pierce's private car sat, waiting. They were a threat held in reserve, a noise waiting to be unleashed. The third finger was Grace. She had met Winnie Hale in a frozen alleyway behind the general store. Taka's fastest scout had found her, carrying a simple message. "He is at the telegraph. He will not stop unless you stop him." Winnie had come without a coat, her face a mask of pale determination. She had the key to the telegraph office in her hand. "Miller, the night operator, is a coward," Winnie whispered, her breath pluming. "He sleeps, but he locks the door. He is afraid of the dark, afraid of us." "And the guards?" Grace asked, her own voice low. She clutched the scraped hide map inside her dress. It felt thin, a fragile shield against the iron of the railroad. "Two at the front, one at the back," Winnie said. "They change at dawn. We have maybe 30 minutes. A shout split the dark. It came from the north side of town. Taka and Koa, they had found the patrol. There was the sound of a scuffle, a grunt, then silence. The diversion had begun. The two guards at the front of the telegraph office cursed, unhitching their rifles, and began to move cautiously toward the sound. "Now," Winnie said. She ran, low and fast, to the back door of the small office. The single guard there was peering into the darkness, distracted. He heard Winnie's key in the lock, and he turned. "What the—" Grace did not wait. She picked up a piece of frozen firewood from the stack by the door and brought it down. Hard. On the man's head. He grunted and collapsed without a sound. Grace stared at him, horrified at what she had done. "He is breathing," Winnie said, pulling the door open. "He will have a headache. Get inside." The office was warm. A single lamp burned low. Just as Winnie had predicted, the operator, Miller, was slumped over his desk, his key, his chair, his world, fast asleep. Winnie turned up the lamp. Grace looked at the man, then at the key. "Wake him!" "No," Winnie said. She looked at the panel of wires on the wall. "He would just sound an alarm." She took a heavy ledger from the desk and, with a grim efficiency, brought it down on the back of Miller's head. He slumped further, completely unconscious. Now he will sleep. Grace looked at Winnie, seeing a coldness there she had not expected. "Let us work," Grace said, her voice shaking only a little. She sat at the key. Her fingers, stiff with cold, found their place. She took a deep breath, pulling the hide map from her dress. She smoothed it on the desk. She thought of her father, of the sound of the key in his quiet store. She began to send. Her fingers flew, the clicking sound filling the small room. It was a language of its own, sharp, fast, and desperate. She did not just send the words. She sent the coordinates from the map. She sent the survey numbers. She sent the aquifer depths. She sent it all, coded, to the Austin Statesman, the biggest paper in the state, the one paper Baron Pierce did not own. She ended the long message with the plain text, "Proof of illegal land seizure, forged surveys, and theft of water by Harlan Pierce and Lyle Crick. Send state investigators. San Madera is being held hostage." As she sent, Winnie was not idle. She had been Ben's friend. She knew the wire system. She took a loose wire from the back of the panel and clipped it, grounding the main line in a way that would create a feedback loop, a leak that would send the signal, weak but audible, over every open line connected to the San Madera switchboard. It was a trick Ben had taught her, a way to listen in. The office door exploded open. Lyle Crick stood there, his face black with rage, his pistol in his hand. Two of his men were behind him. He had not been fooled by the diversion. "You!" he spat, his eyes finding Grace at the desk. "The little spy!" He lunged, grabbing Grace by the hair, dragging her from the chair. He pressed the barrel of his pistol to her temple. The metal was cold. Grace cried out, a sharp sound of pain and fear. Winnie Hale stepped forward.
"Let her go, Lyle."
"Get out of my way, Winnie," he snarled, his arm tightening around Grace's throat. "This does not concern you."
"You lied to me,"
Winnie said, her voice low and shaking, but not with fear, with fury.
"You used me. You used her. You will not do it again."
She stood directly between Crick and the door. Crick laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think you can stop me?" He shifted the gun, aiming it at Winnie's chest. "I have the county seal. I have the guns. I have the railroad. You have nothing."
"She has us,"
a new voice said. Crick spun, dragging Grace with him. The door, the one he had just burst through, was filled. Reverend Ezekiel Hart stood there. His face was as pale as paper, but his eyes were burning. Behind him stood the blacksmith, Samuel's father, holding a massive shotgun. Beside him was Ben, the young telegraph operator, and 2 other ranchers whose land bordered the high pastures. They were all armed. "What is this, preacher?" Crick sneered, his confidence shaken for the first time. "A prayer meeting." "It is a reckoning, Mr. Crick," Hart said, his voice finding a power Grace had never heard. "Ben, he fixed the lines. We heard your orders, but just now, we heard this." He pointed to the telegraph key. "We heard the truth. We heard it all. From the wire Winnie sent to the general store." Crick's face contorted. He had been played. "You are all dead," he hissed, and he raised his pistol, not at Hart, but at Winnie.
"He fired."
Winnie screamed, a high, thin sound, and fell back, clutching her arm. The bullet had torn through the fleshy part of her bicep. At the same instant, the window of the office shattered. An arrow, black-fletched, struck the oil lamp on the wall, plunging the room into darkness. "Grace!" Taka's voice roared from the outside. It was the signal. Absolute chaos erupted. The townsfolk opened fire. Crick's men, blinded by the sudden dark, fired back. The small office was filled with smoke, the flash of muzzles, the smell of gunpowder. Outside, Kawa, his duty done, saw the flashes. He saw the first light of dawn. He saw the piles of railroad ties, soaked in oil, waiting to be laid. He lit the torch he had carried. With a grunt of pain and effort, he threw it with his good arm. It landed with a soft whump. The oil caught instantly. A wall of fire erupted, 50 feet high, turning the pre-dawn dark into a terrible, flickering day. The fire leapt from the ties to the oil warehouse next to them. The railroad itself was now a barrier of flame. In the confusion, Taka smashed the rest of the window and pulled Grace through it. She fell into the snow, gasping. Crick burst out of the door, his eyes wild, his face lit by the inferno he had started. He saw Taka and Grace. He raised his pistol. Taka pushed Grace behind him, his knife in his hand. He had no arrows left. It was a pistol against a knife. But they were not alone. Grace, seeing Taka about to charge, saw the wet frozen leather reins from the guard's horse, still tied to the hitching post. She grabbed them. "Taka!" she screamed. He understood. He did not charge. He feinted, drawing Crick's fire. The bullet went wide. As Crick cocked the hammer again, Taka lunged low. Crick swung the pistol down to club him. Grace threw the wet, heavy reins. The leather loops, stiff with ice, wrapped around Crick's arm, tangling his hand. The gun, it was just for a second, but it was enough. Taka drove his shoulder into Crick's stomach. The man went down. Taka did not use his knife. He twisted the reins, pulling them tight, using the leverage to snap the bone in Crick's wrist. The gun fell. Crick screamed, a sound of agony and defeat. He was not killed. He was disarmed. He was bound. A high, piercing shriek cut through the air, the train whistle. Across the burning yard, Baron Harlan Pierce had seen enough. He had emerged from his private car, seen the fire, seen the armed townsfolk, seen his man captured. He was running back to the car, shouting at the engineer. The train began to move, puffing, gaining speed, heading east. He was escaping. No, not this time. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled, a sound as sharp as a hawk's cry. From the west end of the tracks, an answer came, a thunder. It was Nahari. She and the young men drove the entire herd of horses, panicked by the fire and the noise, directly onto the tracks. They poured over the rails, a wave of brown and black and white horseflesh, running directly at the train. The engineer slammed on the brakes. The engine screeched, steam hissing. As it slid to a halt, its metal frame just feet from the wall of terrified horses, the herd parted, flowing around the train, blocking it, trapping it. Pierce was done. The crowd, a strange new alliance of settlers and Numunu, surged forward. Taka, his arm around Grace, walked through the smoke. Hart and the blacksmith were dragging the wounded, moaning Lyle Crick. They all stopped at the private car. After a long moment, the door opened, and Baron Harlan Pierce stepped out. He was dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, his face pale, his composure perfect. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cool, "there seems to be a misunderstanding."
There is no misunderstanding,
Grace said. Her voice, though quiet, carried in the sudden hush. The fire crackled, the only other sound. She walked forward. She was covered in soot, her hair wild, her dress torn, but she stood as if she were taller than him. She held up the scraped hide map, its lines clear in the firelight. "This," she announced to the crowd, "is the truth. This is the water you all need to live, the water he tried to steal, to make himself a king." Winnie Hale, her arm bound in a bloody rag, stepped forward. She held up the ledger she had taken from the office.
"And this is his journal," she cried. "The fake one he was using, filled with his lies about raids, his plans to move the survey stakes. It is all here."
Pierce looked at the map, at the journal, at the faces of the townsfolk, and for the first time, he knew he had lost. Reverend Hart stepped up, his face grim, his black coat covered in ash. He pointed a trembling finger at Pierce. "Mr. Pierce," he boomed, his voice echoing off the train. "You are held by the authority of the citizens of this community to answer for these crimes. You will await the state investigators." He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at the crowd, at Grace, at Taka. "The truth," he said, "the truth has set us free." The fire burned, but it was no longer a fire of destruction. It was a signal fire, visible for miles. Pierce was held, his face a mask of stone. Crick was bound, his wounded men disarmed. The battle for the wires was over. The battle for the land had just been won. The sun was a thin, bloody smear in the east, its light filtering through the column of oily black smoke that rose from the burning railroad yard. The fire was a terrible, roaring beast, consuming the stacks of ties and the oil warehouse. In its hellish, flickering light, a strange and frozen tableau was held. Baron Harlan Pierce stood by his private car, his velvet jacket soiled, his face a mask of cold fury. Lyle Crick was on the ground, bound by Taka's wet reins, his wrist broken and his voice a low, bubbling string of curses. The townsfolk, the blacksmith, the ranchers, Ben, the telegraph operator, and Reverend Hart stood in a loose, armed half-circle. They were united, for this one moment, by the truth they had heard over the wire. Opposite them stood Taka, Grace, and Koa, whose arm was now bleeding freely again. Behind them, Nahari and the young men were calming the horse herd, which milled nervously, trapped between the stopped train and the town. It was a standoff. Justice had been done by force, but the law was a different, trickier animal. Pierce knew this. He straightened his jacket, His voice was calm, cutting through the crackle of the flames. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing only the white faces in the crowd, "you have committed an act of insurrection. You have destroyed company property. You have assaulted my men. When the state marshals arrive, I will see every one of you in chains." The blacksmith raised his shotgun. "And we will see you in hell." "Stop," Reverend Hart commanded, his voice surprisingly strong. "We will not have more violence. We have him. We have the proof. We will wait for the law."
"And what law is that?"
Preacher Pierce sneered.
"The law that I own, the law that says this land is mine."
A new sound made them all turn. It was not the train from Austin. It was a small steam handcar, pumping furiously up the tracks from the west, from the county seat. It slid to a stop, its brakes hissing. A single figure stepped off. It was not a marshal. It was a woman, wrapped in a heavy black wool coat, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was not young. Her face was brown and lined, her eyes dark and intelligent. She carried a single heavy leather book. She looked at the burning yard, the stopped train, the armed men, the captured baron, and the Commanche. She did not look intimidated. "I am Judge Inez Valdez," she said, her voice clear and precise. "I am the acting circuit judge for this district. I heard a great deal of unusual traffic on the telegraph wire this morning. It seems I have arrived at a busy time." Pierce's composure broke. He took a step forward.
"Judge, thank God. These men, these savages, they have attacked my property. I demand you arrest them all."
Judge Valdez looked at him, her gaze flat. "I demand nothing. Mr. Pierce, I am the law." She held up her book, and by the emergency powers granted to me by the state of Texas, in the face of an apparent public insurrection, I am declaring this platform a provisional court. This hearing is now in session. It was a move of pure, audacious genius. It was frontier law, stripped to its bones. She was taking the power from the mob and from the baron, and placing it in her own hands. She pointed to Ben. "Young man, you are the telegrapher. You will be my clerk. Write down everything you see." She pointed to Crick, who was now quiet, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "Bring that man here." And she looked at Taka and Grace. "I will hear your testimony first." One by one, they gave it. Grace, her voice shaking but clear, presented the map she had drawn on the hide. She explained the cipher. She explained the aquifer. She told the court that Pierce was not just stealing grazing land. He was stealing the water, the very life, from the entire territory. Then Taka and Kawa stepped forward. Kawa, his face gray with pain, held up the fake survey stake they had recovered. He told the judge how he had watched the men of Crick move the boundary markers in the night, stealing land yard by yard. Then Winnie Hale, her arm in a sling fashioned from a torn petticoat, was brought forward. She was weak, but her voice was a cold, sharp blade. She presented the false ledger. She told the court about the lies of Crick. She told them how he had paid a man to take her away. She told them he had boasted of his plans. She told them he had fired first, that he had tried to kill her. The blacksmith, the father of Samuel, came forward. He held up the spent cartridges they had found after the night attack on the teepee of Taka. "These are from the rifles of the railroad guards," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not arrows. They fired on a camp with a woman in it." The crowd murmured. The evidence was a chain, link by link, being wrapped around Pierce. Judge Valdez looked at the baron. "Mr. Pierce, your response." Pierce was a powerful man. He had not gotten where he was by folding. He drew himself up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Judge, this is a farce, a collection of grievances from disgruntled settlers and natives. I am the president of a chartered railroad. I have a contract with the United States government. My men were providing security, a necessary action in a hostile territory. The railroad must be protected. Progress must be served. These actions, while perhaps enthusiastic, were all in the service of taming this land, of bringing prosperity to this very town." He was good. He was appealing to their fear, to their wallets. Grace saw the saloon keeper nod. She saw the general store owner look at his feet, his loyalty wavering. Just as the balance seemed to be tipping, a new whistle sounded from the east. The track was clear now. The horses pulled back. It was the morning train from Austin. It hissed to a stop. A single man stepped out. His clothes clean, his face eager. He held a small notebook and a pencil. He looked at the smoking ruins, the armed crowd, and the assembled court on the platform. He hurried forward. "Baron Harlan Pierce," he called out. "My name is Edward Millis. From the Austin Statesman. I received a most extraordinary telegraph message. Something about a secret water map and—" he looked at his notes. "An illegal land seizure. Would you care to comment?" Pierce went white. He looked at the journalist, this small, unarmed man with a notebook. This was a weapon he could not fight. This was not a local dispute anymore. This was a story. His investors in the East would read it. His political allies in Austin would read it. He was no longer a baron in his remote kingdom. He was a criminal, exposed in the town square. He said nothing. His silence was a confession. Judge Inez Valdez stood. She waited until the entire platform was silent. The only sounds, the dying crackle of the fire and the scratch of the pencil of the journalist. "This court," she said, her voice ringing in the cold morning air, "finds that a conspiracy to commit fraud and incite violence has been perpetrated against the citizens of this county and the Numunu people." She pointed to the train. "The expansion of the San Madera spur line is hereby frozen. All work will stop, pending a full investigation by the state." She pointed to the hide map. "The fraudulent survey lines filed by Mr. Crick are declared null and void. The ancestral grazing rights to the high pastures are affirmed, to be respected by all parties until the state can review the treaty." She looked at Pierce. "Baron Harlan Pierce, you will be remanded to the custody of the state investigators, who, I am told, are not far behind this journalist. A full investigation into the charter and business practices of your company is hereby ordered." Finally, she looked at Lyle Crick, who had slumped against the station wall. "Lyle Crick, you are arrested for conspiracy, theft, and the attempted murder of Miss Winnie Hale." She looked at the blacksmith. "Take him to the town jail. He will be held for transport." A sound split the air. It was applause. A wild, ragged cheer from the ranchers, from Ben, from the men who had followed the Reverend, but it was not unanimous. Across the tracks, the railroad men, the saloon keeper, the men who lived on the wages of Pierce, watched in sullen, angry silence. The battle was over. The war was not. We all drink from the same land," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking at the townsfolk, the angry ones and the relieved ones. You cannot win a fight by poisoning the well. No one wins when the water is dry. He looked at Grace and then back at the crowd. We only win when the heart has enough water to share. Grace stepped forward, taking her place beside him. The soot on her face was a warrior's mark. "The water is for everyone," she said, her voice clear. "The land is for everyone. And the school is for everyone." She looked at Samuel, who was peering out from behind his father. "My school is open. I invite every child back. We will learn together." Reverend Hart pushed through the crowd. His face was a map of shame and soot. He stopped in front of Grace and Taka. "Miss Fallon," he said, his voice thick, "I was a coward. I chose the appearance of peace over the soul of truth. I let my fear of that man." He pointed at Pierce, who was now being quietly guarded. "Make me his accomplice. I ask for your forgiveness." And he turned to Taka, his eyes on the ground, "and the forgiveness of your people and of God." A hand touched Grace's arm. It was Winnie. A woman from the town had bandaged her arm properly. She looked pale, but she was smiling. "I am not staying, Grace," she whispered. The journalist was trying to get her attention, but she ignored him. "I have a ticket for the train heading west. There is too much here."
"Winnie, you—"
"We did it," Winnie said, her smile fierce.
"You ruined him. You truly did."
She pulled Grace into a quick, tight hug. It was the embrace of soldiers, of survivors. "Do not let them bully you, Grace." She turned, and without a backward glance, boarded the westbound train, a free woman, leaving on her own terms. Far from the crowd, by the milling, nervous herd, Nahari lit a bundle of sage. The clean, sharp smoke rose in a thin, pure column, a contrast to the black plume from the yard. She raised her wrinkled hands, her voice a low chant of gratitude to the ancestors. "The wind," she murmured in her language, "carries the good news. Let it travel far. Let it tell them we are still here." The sun was higher now, a promise of warmth in a cold blue sky. The immediate danger was past. From the smoking ruins, a new sound began, a steady, rhythmic clang, clang, clang. The blacksmith, his sons, and some of the ranchers had already picked up hammers. They were not celebrating. They were working. They were clearing the debris. It was not a sound of victory. It was the sound of repair. It was the first, hard, subdued note of whatever came next. The smoke cleared, but the smell of scorched oil and charred pine lingered for days, a bitter reminder of how close San Madera had come to its own end. The great, black scar in the railroad yard was the first thing people saw at dawn and the last thing they saw at dusk. Kawa did not die. The bullet, as it turned out, had missed the bone, and Nahari's poultices drew the fever out of him. His healing was slow, a long, painful process that left him impatient and restless. But it was healing nonetheless. Meadowlark, his wife, stayed by his side, her quiet strength a match for his own. Taka sat with him often, the two men sharing a silence that spoke more than any words. The bond between them, tested by fire and betrayal, was now forged into something unbreakable. While Kawa mended, the first sign of a true peace arrived, not from the town, but from the herd. One morning, as Taka and Grace walked the high pastures, checking the horses that had been scattered by the confrontation, they found a new life. A mare Taka had been watching stood apart, and at her feet, struggling to stand on wobbly, new legs, was a foal. It was a perfect filly, the color of wet sand. Taka stopped, his breath catching. He reached out a hand, not to the foal, but to Grace's arm, his grip tight. It was the first foal of the season, a beginning, a promise from the land itself that life, after all the fire and ice, would continue. Grace laid her hand over his, and they watched the small creature take its first, uncertain steps. It was a profound, quiet blessing, more powerful than any sermon. The law, having arrived, moved with grinding, impersonal speed. The state investigators, grim men in dark suits who had arrived on the train from Austin, were horrified by the Austin Statesman article and the physical evidence of the burned yard. They interviewed Judge Valdez. They interviewed Reverend Hart. They interviewed the blacksmith and Ben. Baron Harlan Pierce, stripped of his power, was escorted onto the eastbound train. He was not in chains, but he was a prisoner, his career and his reputation in ruins. He looked at Taka and Grace as he passed, his face not one of remorse, but of cold, reptilian calculation. He had not learned a lesson. He had simply lost a match. His departure left a vacuum, a space of silence and uncertainty. Weeks passed. The snow melted, revealing the brown, muddy earth. And then, miraculously, the first hints of green, the railroad company, its name now tied to fraud and violence in the state capital, moved quickly to control the damage. They sent a new man. His name was Mr. Elias Thorne. He was not a baron. He was an administrator. He was a small man with round glasses, a neat mustache, and hands clean of anything but ink. He came not with guns, but with contracts. He called a meeting. Judge Valdez, who had delayed her departure, presided. Taka was there, and Mr. Thorne, to the surprise of many, insisted that Grace be there as well, having read the reports of her involvement with the telegraph. "We are not in the business of war," Mr. Thorne said, his voice dry. "We are in the business of transport. My predecessor was intemperate. He has cost this company a great deal of money." He unrolled a new map. It was not the secret aquifer map. It was a new survey, one that clearly showed the railroad spur line bending south, completely avoiding the high pastures. "We find this route to be more stable and," he added, "less complicated." He offered a memorandum, a formal ecological corridor. He called it a right-of-way for the Numunu herds, to be respected by the railroad in perpetuity. Taka looked at Grace. She read the document twice. It was ironclad. It was everything they had fought for, handed over in a clean white envelope. Taka signed his name, a simple, strong mark. The railroad had turned. Nahari's words had come true. The town, however, healed more slowly than the land. The division was still there, a jagged line between those who had followed Hart and those who had relied on Pierce's wages. But with Pierce gone, and with the railroad security force disbanded and replaced by a few quiet company guards, the open hostility began to fade. Mr. Silas Croft, the proprietor of the general store, was the first to bend. He had watched his own son, Samuel, follow Grace to the native camp. He had stood with the Reverend, his shotgun in his hands. He was a changed man. One afternoon, Nahari and Meadowlark walked into his store to trade for needles and thread. The store went quiet. The other customers, women Grace recognized, stared. Mr. Croft, after a long pause, simply nodded. "What can I get for you?" "Ladies," he asked. He served them fairly, and as they left, he walked to his front window and took down a small, fly-specked sign that had hung there for years. The sign said, "No service for Indians." He tore it in half and dropped it into the wood stove. It was not a revolution. It was an opening, a door, pushed ajar. Grace's school was the hinge on which that door swung. Reverend Hart, in an act of public penance, offered her the church itself, but she refused. She took the canvas tent, the one she'd been thrown out of, and set it up on the patch of ground between the church and the creek. It was on neutral ground. The children came back. First Samuel, then the other town children, then, shyly, Maki and Tona, and the other children from the camp. Grace's school was the only place in San Madera where the two worlds sat side by side. Equals, learning the same alphabet. They had few books, most of them tattered and worn. Meadowlark, whose hands were clever, showed Grace how to use discarded scraps of leather from the camp. They sat together, cutting and sewing, giving the old, broken books new, strong covers. One afternoon, Grace wrote the word water on the slate blackboard. Taka, who had come to walk her home, stood in the entrance. He watched the children, a mix of pale and dark heads, all bent over their slates. He picked up a piece of chalk. Next to her word, he wrote the Numunu word for it. The children looked at him, then at Grace. She smiled. "Copy them both. She said they will both be on the test." The small teepee by the creek was no longer enough. It was a shelter, not a home. Taka and Grace were a unit, a strange, powerful partnership that existed between two worlds. They needed a home that did the same. Taka chose a place on a low bluff overlooking the valley. It had the creek behind it, and the wide pastures in front. He could see the town, and he could see his herds. He, Kawa, and Abel, the blacksmith, raised the frame. It was not a log cabin. It was a small, strong house of milled lumber, bought with Taka's horse trading money. It had a plank floor, a stone fireplace, and real glass windows. But Taka built the roof his own way. It was a high, peaked frame, stretched with treated canvas, with a central, open smoke hole that could be covered in bad weather. It was a house with the heart of a teepee. They built their life inside it. Grace brought her one remaining book, a volume of poetry her mother had loved. Taka brought the painted shield his father had carried. He built shelves. She hung curtains. They were small, domestic acts that felt more profound, more permanent than any public declaration. Reverend Hart knew his apology needed more than words. He organized a town gathering. He did not call it a reconciliation. He called it a community supper. He set up tables outside the church, in the open air. He and the blacksmith roasted a steer. Everyone was invited, and, to the town's quiet shock, they came. Taka led his people. They did not come as guests. They came as partners, bringing smoked fish, dried berries, and roasted prairie turnips. Nahari herself added her contribution to the main stew pot. Not everyone from the town came. The angriest, the ones who had lost their mercenary wages, stayed away, drinking in the saloon. But most came. They stood in the same line. They ate from the same pot. Reverend Hart stood on a wagon bed, his voice thick. "I failed this community," he said. "I was a man of God who listened to a man of money. I was afraid. I apologized to Grace Fallon, whom I cast out, and I apologized to Taka and his people, whose land I was complicit in stealing." He bowed his head. "I ask for your forgiveness." Nahari stood then. She spoke in her own language, her voice surprisingly strong. And Taka translated. "The land," she said, "does not belong to us. We belong to it. The water beneath does not ask whose throat it slakes. It only asks that it be shared. We have eaten together. This is a good start." There was one last piece of the past. Judge Valdez, before she left, convened a final meeting of the town council. The state investigators had sent their preliminary report. It confirmed that Baron Pierce's company had engaged in a pattern of systematic, fraudulent foreclosures, using predatory fees to seize deeds. Grace was there. She listened, her heart pounding, as the judge read a list of names, of families, and then she heard it. Fallon, the debt, the fees, all of it was declared illegal, an act of corporate malfeasance. The council voted unanimously to void the debts. It was over. The farm was gone, lost to time, but the shame, the stain of the debt, was lifted. The scar on her family's name was finally, truly healed. Time moved on. The season turned to spring, green and full of promise. The hybrid schoolhouse was filled with the sound of children's voices. One afternoon, Grace saw them all gathered not around her, but around Nahari, who was seated in a place of honor. The old woman was telling a story. She was telling them about the long winter. She spoke of the iron snake that tried to poison the water. She spoke of a woman who came from the east, who could read the storm of the wires. She spoke of the warrior who saved his friend, and the preacher who found his voice in the fire. The children, white and Commanche, sat mesmerized. Nahari was turning their shared, painful history into a story, a lesson that would outlast the people who had lived it. The 6-month contract, the one Mistress Quill had written, was a distant memory. It was a sunny, warm day, the kind that feels like a blessing. Taka and Grace stood on the porch of their new home. Below them, the town and the people had gathered. They were not two crowds. They were one. Reverend Hart stood on Grace's right. Nahari stood on Taka's left. This was not a wedding that belonged to one world. It belonged to both. Taka took her hands. They were chapped, strong hands, no longer the pale hands of a displaced teacher. He did not have a white man's ring. He spoke, his voice for her, but loud enough for all to hear. "You are the fire in my lodge. Grace Fallon, you are the clear eye that sees the truth. I will be the shield for your heart." Grace looked at him, at the man she had feared, and then admired, and now loved. "My heart is your home." "Taka," she said, her voice clear, "you are the strong root that holds the ground. I will be the voice for your truth." Nahari stepped forward. She did not use the old, simple leather ties. She brought a new cord, one she had braided herself, bright with blue and red beads, strong and beautiful. She wrapped it around their joined hands, binding them together. Reverend Hart read a short blessing from his Bible, his voice thick with emotion. Later that night, they lay in the quiet of their home. The storm was over. The fight was done. The new, hard work of living was just beginning. Through the open smoke hole, they could see a scrap of starry sky. And from the valley below, carried on the soft, warm wind, came the sound of the horse herd, grazing in the dark. It was the sound of peace. The year turned. 1888 arrived, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet thaw. The great snow-packed drifts of winter softened, shrank, and then at last gave way, revealing a land that was not dead, but sleeping. The plains, which had been a harsh, blinding white, turned to a deep, wet brown. And then, as if by a miracle, the first spears of new green pushed through. The grass, the lifeblood of the prairie, was returning. In the valley, the sound of hammers had been replaced by the sound of shovels. The aquifer, the secret map that Grace had held in her mind, was no longer a weapon. It was a promise. Under the direction of Taka, and with the engineering skill of Abel, the blacksmith, a new project began. It was not a dam or a great canal. It was a simple, humble ditch, a small irrigation ditch. It began at a spring head, fed by the aquifer, and wound its way in a careful, gentle line, dividing the land. It ran past the edge of the New Munu horse pasture, and then continued on to water the small farm plots behind the town. It was a line of shared life. Before Judge Valdez had left, she had drawn up one final document, a water rights agreement. It was signed by Taka, representing the people, and by Reverend Hart and Abel, representing the town council. The paper, stamped with the official state seal, was now nailed inside the town hall. It guaranteed access for all. The water that had been a source of greed and conflict was now a bond, a shared artery. The canvas tent, Grace's first Defiant school, was gone. In its place, on the same neutral ground between the town and the camp, stood a new building. It was made of fresh pine, and it smelled of sawdust and hope. The blacksmith had forged the hinges for the door. The railroad, in the person of Mr. Elias Thorne, had donated the glass for the two tall windows. It was the first and only new public building in San Madera. Inside, the change was just as profound. Grace stood at the front, a piece of white chalk in her hand. On the large black slate, she wrote the alphabet, the familiar, sharp letters of her own language. But beside it, there was now another set of symbols. Taka, in the long winter nights, had shown her the pictographs his people used, the symbols for horse and water and man and heart. Now, they sat side by side. The children, Samuel and Maki, and all the others, learned both. They were learning not just to read, but to see two worlds at once. One afternoon, as Grace was dismissing the children, Nahari entered the schoolhouse. She had not come to see the building. She had come to see Grace. The old woman walked to the blackboard, her eyes tracing the two sets of letters. She nodded, a slow, deep gesture of approval. She turned to Grace. She spoke, her voice soft, but her words, as always, carried weight. Taka, who had been waiting outside, stepped in to stand beside his wife. He translated, "My grandmother says you have a new name. She says you are no longer just Grace, the daughter of Fallon. You are one of us now, and you need a name that speaks of your spirit." She looked at the telegraph key, which Grace now kept on her desk, a relic, a reminder. "She calls you," Taka said, his voice thick with pride. "Papi Omtua, she who keeps the waves." Grace felt tears well, hot and sudden. It was not a title. It was a life. It was a name that had been earned, not given. She was no longer a victim, no longer a peace bride. She was the woman who kept the waves, the one who had turned the enemy's weapon into a tool for truth. She bowed her head to the old woman, a gesture of thanks that needed no translation. Taka, too, had a new role. The Council of Elders had seen the wisdom of his actions. The winter had proven that a warrior's strength was not just in his arm, but in his mind and in his heart. When the spring trade season began, they did not send a delegation of older, more cautious men. They chose Taka. He was now the ambassador of the horse, the primary trader between his people and the settlements to the east. It was a position of great trust, and it suited him. He was a bridge, just as the elders had originally hoped. But he was a bridge he had built himself, on his own terms. He had not, however, given up his other role. He was a teacher, just as much as Grace. In the afternoons, when the schoolhouse was quiet, he would take the children, all of them, to the pasture. He taught them to ride, not with fear, but with balance. He taught them to speak to the horses, to listen. He sat them by the creek and told them the stories of his people, the old stories of how the horse and the numunu were brothers, how one could not live without the other. Samuel and Maki sat side by side, listening, their world growing larger with every word. The ripples of their winter spread far. Reverend Hart sat in his small office, the church door open to the warm spring air. He was writing. It was not a sermon. It was a letter, addressed to the editor of the Austin Statesman. He wrote of the fire and the greed. He wrote of his own fear, his own failure, and then he wrote of the new beginning. He described the shared supper, the new school, the water ditch that served both peoples. Peace, he wrote, his pen scratching firmly, is not a quiet thing. It is not the absence of a fight. Peace is the hard, daily work of justice. It begins not with a proclamation, but with a shared meal and a fair signature. He signed his name, folded the paper, and took it to the station himself. A week later, the westbound train brought a letter for Grace. It was postmarked from Santa Fe, a place that seemed a world away. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unfamiliar. She opened it. Dear Grace, it began. She knew then. You will be surprised to hear from me. I have found a good position here. I am an accountant for a large mercantile. They value my skill with numbers. They do not ask about my past. I have found, for the first time in my life, that I am respected for my mind. I am an honest woman. Grace, I am proving it to myself every day. Grace smiled, her heart full. Winnie had found her own way. I hear you are married, the letter continued. Truly married this time, and that the school is real. I am glad. You are the only one who saw me as more than a fool. You saw the truth. I will come back and visit. One day, I promise. I want to see the school you built, your friend, Winnie Hale. Spring turned to summer. The grasses grew high, thick and green, feeding the fat, healthy foals in the herd, to celebrate the season and to celebrate the water that flowed steadily in the new ditch. The town and the camp held a festival. It was not a religious holiday for either, but something new, something born of their shared experience. They called it the water feast. They met on the banks of the creek, and the fires burned all night. Abel, the blacksmith, brought his fiddle. Kawa, his arm now strong, brought a drum. They did not play the same songs, but they played in the same rhythm, and the two sounds, one high and fast, one deep and steady, wove together in the night air. Taka took Grace's hand and led her to the fire. They danced. It was not the formal waltz of her old life, nor the shuffling, sacred dance of his. It was something in between. They moved around the fire, their feet on the warm earth, their shadows stretching and joining. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. She thought of her family, of the farm, of the cold, lonely woman who had stepped off the train, her future a blank, terrifying page. Taka held her close. He thought of the woman he had lost, the cold grief that had encased his heart. He looked down at Grace, at this fierce, brave woman who had jumped into ice for him, for his people. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that this new love was not a betrayal of the old. It was not forgetting. It was the only way life could be preserved. It was the heart, choosing to beat again. High above them, a shadow passed against the stars. Taka stopped, his hand tightening on hers. He pointed. A hawk. It circled, once, twice, in the vast, moonlit sky. It was the same hawk he had seen on the day of their first, tense bargain. But it was not a warning now. It was not a sign of trials to come. It was a guardian. It was a blessing. The wind, which had once been their enemy, now blew soft and warm from the south, carrying the scent of new grass and clean water. Later, in the quiet of their home, a peaceful quiet settled. Grace sat at the small table Taka had built for her, a slate in her lap. She was planning the next day's lesson. She wrote the word, first in the clean, familiar lines of English freedom. Then, beside it, her hand moving with a new, practiced grace. She drew the pictograph for it, a horse, untethered, its mane flying in the wind. Outside, on the porch, Taka was mending the small gate that led to their yard. He took a new piece of rawhide, one Nahari had dyed a deep, rich blue, and braided it into the gatepost. Next to the beaded cord from their wedding, it was a small, simple decoration. One home, two traditions. He finished and came to stand beside her. He looked at the slate in her lap. "Freedom," he said, his voice quiet. He touched the English letters. "That is your word." Then he touched the pictograph. "That is mine. They are the same." "They are the same," she agreed. They stood together on the porch, looking out at the valley. The lights of San Madera were few, and the fires of the camp were low. The world was sleeping, safe, and watered. Taka took her hand. "The path may run dry again," he said. Grace leaned against him, her head on his chest. "If it does," she said, "we will dig again." "And if the heart runs dry of courage?" he asked. "Then," Grace said, her voice sure, "we will tell the story again." The future was not a straight, iron track. It was a winding, open plain, and they would walk it together. Thank you for listening to the story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.